And hello, welcome to Social Justice Forums. I am Daren Jaime. We thank you for joining us. Now, if you're asking the question, what is the show all about? We bring you a forum that's discussing and providing deeper understanding of the issues and inequities that so many people face. Things such as systemic inequalities to pressing social problems. Our guests provide multiple perspectives as well as insights, helping us better understand and address these challenges. So we invite you to stay connected to us. Social Justice Forum starts now. And welcome back. In Tucson, Arizona, a Superfund site from the post-war era has irreversibly impacted our aquifer, significantly affecting the nearby Mexican-American community. Our next guest guides us through her book, Exploring It, Concept of a Disabled Ecology, where human and natural vulnerabilities intertwine amidst ecological degradation. Here now to join us is the author of Disabled Ecologies, Lessons from a Wounded Desert, Sunaura Taylor. And Sunaura, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Daren. I'm really excited to be here and just really love the whole concept of your show. So thank you.
No, thank you. It's a great opportunity to really talk and discuss. And when we talk about this here, disabled ecologies, want to talk a little bit about that. Break it down for us for somebody who may not be so familiar.
Absolutely. Okay, so maybe the best way for me to sort of start introducing people to the concept is actually with my own personal story. So I was born disabled and raised with the understanding that my disability emerged from or was caused by contamination on the south side of Tucson, defense industry contamination from Hughes aircraft, which then became Raytheon. And so, I've always been curious about what happened. We moved away when I was quite young. And so I wanted to better understand this contamination and this history. But also, having this sort of origin story really helped me think about disability and environment in particular ways. So from a really young age, I understood that disability was something that wasn't just a personal problem, right? That is a problem that is, that's something that is caused by and can be caused by, social inequality, pollution, war, environmental racism. And I also had an understanding that nature, right, isn't something separate from us, that human beings can be harmed, of course, by the same things that are harming nature. And so it's really those concepts that I'm exploring in this book. So I went back to Tucson, moved back to Tucson with my family, and really wanted to better understand what had happened. And I found that sort of following the various trails of disability was one way of doing that. So the disablement that impacted the human beings and community who were impacted, right? As you said in your intro, largely Mexican American community, the illnesses and impairments that impacted the wildlife, the ecosystems, those. And so a disabled ecology to me is almost a way of mapping that kind of human and non-human injury that can emerge from these sites of harm.
Yeah, and you broke down the definition in a great way, because I think now we have a better understanding about it. But take us to Tucson and
Yeah.
take us there, because we have this community in Tucson, Arizona, and you have the contamination of the aquifer. What can you tell us about this and how this really all played out?
Absolutely. One of the things that I was so surprised to find, right? My family had a lot of privilege. We were white, we were upwardly mobile. So we moved once from that neighborhood. Once, we found out that there was contamination. My parents moved. I was, of course, only very young. And so I didn't grow up with with this sort of sense of what was actually happening there. And when I moved back to Tucson, what I found, which was so amazing to me, was that there was a whole incredible environmental justice movement that emerged in response to the contamination, and in fact, it was one of the earliest environmental justice movements in the country. So they formed in 1985. So what happened essentially is that there was, all sorts of aircraft industry that had moved into Tucson in the post-war era. And they just started, essentially dumping their toxic chemicals onto the desert ground, and along fences and desert washes. And then eventually Hughes Aircraft built these huge lagoons, but they weren't lined. They didn't put any sort of lining, and they dumped their contaminants in there. And so, of course, what's going to happen is, those contaminants are going to sink into the desert ground and eventually reach Tucson's groundwater. And that groundwater, made its way into the drinking water of the community. Like so many other cases of environmental racism, what was really, also, so horrendous was the response of city officials who, even once they learned of, that certain wells were contaminated, they didn't do the work to figure out who potentially had been drinking that water. Once it really came to public light, thanks to community organizing and a really amazing investigative journalist, Jane Kay, then the city officials, essentially blamed the community, saying that they were already predisposed to illness or were sick because of their lifestyle, right? These extremely racist and ableist kind of ways, accusations, and kind of ways of dismissing the community's concerns.
Yeah, and Sunaura, one thing to mention is you have a Mexican American population that actually lives right above this here. And so
Yes.
how are they impacted by this?
Yeah, so they were the most impacted, right? They drank this water, they bathed in this water, they played in this water. I have a lot of the people who I spoke to, who, of course, this was the 80s, and so a lot of them are retired in their kind of retired years now. And they remember being children, just playing in the desert washes, having no idea that there were tons of contaminants coming through. So people experience a variety of cancers, of different, significant illnesses and diseases. Lupus. There was particularly really high rates of testicular cancer, but a whole variety of conditions. And that was actually part of it was kind of used against the community that there was such a broad range of illnesses and birth issues that emerged from this contamination, because the polluters essentially said that, all of these conditions can't be caused by this by this one contamination, source of contamination, but of course they could be. So
Yeah. And when we talk about this, I understand that this is prevalent in areas where there's little to no voices that are really speaking up and speaking out. I'm reminded of Flint, Michigan. I've done
Absolutely.
extensive work there, and these sound synonymous, right?
Yeah.
What can we do as a community? Because while we're talking Tucson, Arizona, there's Flint, Michigan. You got parts of New York. I can take you to upstate New York. I can take you even downstate, where there's questions and concerns that that arise on the similar side of this. What can we do to be more hyper vigilant on this?
It's so agonizing, because one of the reasons why I actually decided to investigate in Tucson is not only because of my personal connection to it, but on one level because it's so typical, right? You're totally right that these sorts of stories are all over, where I am too, in the Bay Area. And so, what I find so sort of hopeful is the amazing organizing that comes out of these communities. So Tucsonans for a Clean Environment, which was the group that emerged in response to this contamination, they had this really radical, expansive vision of justice that I think that we can all learn from. And that, again, I think is actually a lot of communities fighting these kinds of issues have a similar kind of a vision, and a lot that we can learn from, and sort of what they're calling for, right? So, a call for the polluters to be held to account, a call for there to really be a grappling with the racism and class inequality that leads to these neighborhoods and communities being kind of seen as sacrifice zones in the first place. A call for the landscapes that are impacted to be treated with care, and of course a call for community members to also receive care and treatment, right? To also not be left decades later still dealing with their illnesses and conditions without without kind of health care, right? So I think that, in terms of what can be done beforehand, I think that we all have to be really attentive to when corporations are trying to move in, when they're trying to get away with, not following certain kinds of our regulations around toxicity and stuff like that are not good enough, but especially when corporations can get away with not even following what actually already exists. But I also think that it's really important to think about prevention, of course, but also what we can do as as a community to really think about what these communities who already have been impacted need. And a lot of the time, I think that healthcare is the issue that continuously remains. So something like a universal healthcare could help with that sort of dynamic as well.
Yeah. So, what kind of things are we advocating for now as we talk about the work that you're doing? Let's get to the advocacy component. What are you advocating for?
Well, I think I just said one of them, universal healthcare. These broad kinds of policies that could just help support communities in all sorts of ways. Could be a way of addressing these kinds of harms that come from contamination as well, right? So, but I also think that there needs to be a whole shift in the way that we're thinking about the relationship between like harm to the environment and harm to human beings. And sort of, we're so used to thinking about, environmental remediation as something that's over here, and then human health as being something that's over here in a separate arena, right? But what we see again and again, like look all around us, right? The hurricanes, the fires, all the ways in which human beings are just completely implicated, and our health is completely impacted by these dynamics. And so I think really taking climate policy seriously, right? A Green New Deal would go a long way to address so many of these issues. So, this book isn't specifically, I'm not a policy person, so I can't specifically say this and this and this. But, I think that those kind of broad, really reconfigurations of the way that we're thinking about what's important in society would be would be really helpful.
I need to be transparent for a moment and say that, I'm thinking about the fact of when I think about, environmental relationships and I think about environmental injustice, it doesn't always come to mind disability, and here we are, and you're doing a great job of causing people not to rethink, but to honestly think about this. And I mean, I really had to give it some thought, particularly after I think about Flint, Michigan. I think about a lot of the disability that came out of that with people who have, complications with lead and things of that nature. Yeah. Same thing happening right now, in Tucson. What can we do to raise and amplify the voice? That way people can become more familiar and be able to link disability with environmental relationships.
Well, I think you're exactly right for us to just look around. Look at what's happening in Arizona right now, right, with all of the heat-related deaths. The people who are most likely to experience heat-related deaths are people who are already, have have conditions, that make them more vulnerable to heat, right? And these are often the same kinds of conditions that are entangled with, other kinds of inequalities, right? So I think disability and illness are really helpful ways of trying to understand what's happening, because we care about those issues, right? We want to create or at least I hope, right, that we want a world that values and helps support, creates the conditions for disabled and ill people and communities to be able to live good lives and thrive. And the more we have these kinds of environmental intense disasters, but just also the ongoing kind of constant daily reality of heat waves and living in toxic environments, then the harder that is. So I think looking to communities themselves and really listening to what they need, right, and what they're calling for.
So Sunaura, for people who want to, put their hands on this book, Disabled Ecologies, how do they go about doing that?
Well, you can get the book at, anywhere books are sold, and you can learn more about me at my website, sunauratayler.net.
What do you want people to take away after reading your book?
I actually, I actually want people to be hopeful. One of the reasons why I think disability is an important lens versus, say, a lot of people write about how the planet is dying, right? Or like there's this sort of catastrophic end to nature. And the thing about disability to me is that I know that disability can be a profoundly scary and hard experience, right? But we also know from disability communities that people can make beautiful, thriving lives living with disability. And I think that sort of thriving way of living is what I'm hoping for not only disabled human communities, but for our ongoing, now our essentially disabled environments.
So for people, they know all the platforms where books are sold. You can pretty much get in touch there. It's a great conversation. I want to thank you so much for joining us. I really enjoyed us having an opportunity to discuss about, ecological issues, because when you talk about social justice, ecological justice is tied to social justice, and and disabilities. Those who live in the disability in that community have to also be tied to that too. And how you've been able to really correlate the two in this conversation has given me definitely some food for thought, and say I got to bring you back. So, Sunaura, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much. This was really fun. I really appreciate it.
Glad to have you. Thank you.
All
right, listen, we're taking a quick break. We got more coming up right after this.
Hey, creative family, my name is Timothy Coleman, and I'm the Director of Education here at BronxNet. And I'm standing in BronxNet's Media and Technology Studios in the South Bronx, because I want to let you know about an amazing program that we're bringing back that highlights the creativity of community members just like you. Emerging Media Makers is a show that introduces you to BronxNet certified producers. They've taken a step in their creative journey by enrolling in BronxNet's media training classes. On this show, you'll get to see the many ways that our certified producers have created a space that's all their own. Emerging media makers, your passion lives here.
19.7% of Bronxites currently experience food insecurity. Meanwhile, instead of these nice, colorful foods, this is the best food that they have access to. If this sounds like you, there are a bunch of resources to get healthy food for free or cheap. If you want to help, you might consider donating or volunteering in one of these places. Community fridges like this one are all over the city, and allow New Yorkers to conveniently donate extra food to people who might need it. Go to this link and find your nearest one. Food banks and pop-up events like these provide millions of healthy meals to families in need. These organizations are distributing meals to Bronxites as we speak, and are always accepting donations and volunteers.
And welcome back. Since its inception in 2016, Witness to Mass Incarceration has spearheaded initiatives aimed at reshaping the narrative around incarcerated and formerly incarcerated individuals. Their efforts encompass documentation, leadership training, and advocacy to enhance safety within correctional facilities and support successful reentry into society. Joining me now and sharing his point of view on the matter, I'm joined by the founder and executive director of Witness to Mass Incarceration, I should say, Evie Litwok, and thank you so much for joining us here and being with us. I said he, I should say she. Forgive me, I'm already off to the wrong foot, but Evie, glad to have you with us.
Okay, nice to be here, and thanks for inviting me.
No, thank you. Listen, when we talk about mass incarceration, it is still something that in the year 2024 we're still discussing. Numbers continue to rise, and people are questioning how can we get around this thing of mass incarceration that particularly affects communities of color?
Well, I don't think we can get around the issue of mass incarceration. I think that what we have to do is work towards stopping the cycle of reincarceration, which I think would make a great deal of difference. And one of the problems that we face is that when people are released from prison, as I was 10 years ago, I remained homeless and penniless for 16 months because although there are resources for us, those resources tend to be very transactional, and they don't provide a path to rebuilding your life. So one of the things that I believe we all should be focusing on is helping people to earn a living. Because if they can earn a living, they can be housed and they can be food secure. And I think once that happens, we break part of the cycle. It doesn't deal with the entire question, but it deals with part of the cycle.
Well, when you talk to those who've been incarcerated, one of the things we hear is recidivism's enemy is the fact of access to opportunity. Sometimes opportunities are not readily available, resources not readily available. For you, can you describe your experience and the experience of others who really find themselves trying to navigate and say, I want to reintegrate into society, but sometimes I just don't have all that I need?
So I went to prison at age 60, having had 30 years of work history, including 12 on Wall Street and 10 running nonprofits. So I expected to be able to get at least an entry-level job somewhere. Sent out 200 applications, received no response. And the only job I was able to get in the 16 months was with, honestly, The Gap, where I had to stand on my feet all day. And if I dared to sit down, I was fired. We are not very welcome in employable places. And what I began to realize is that I should be focusing on supporting all the people, particularly in the New York City area, who were trying to build small businesses, because small business means we own it, we won't fire ourselves. And in terms of the resource question you asked me, There are resources. There's $100 million worth of services out there. But the problem with the services as they exist is, one, they've been around for 30 years and recidivism has not been reduced, and long-term employment and housing has not been created. And if that's the case, why do we keep doing the same thing? So what you have happening is, as people are coming out of prison who are formerly incarcerated, they are building the smaller grassroots organizations that are dealing directly with transformational issues. So when you go to the services, you do get a meal, you do get a Metro card, you do get a resume, you do get employment training, you do get an opportunity for 1 or 2 interviews, and then you're done. And so they show numbers, well, we help 10,000 people. But those numbers are not what they seem to be, because getting a meal does not help build my future. And what we need is a focus on, for example, we started a program. We're in our 3rd cohort. We have an office space. We're in partnership with the Queens Economic Development Corp, and we have a pre-apprentice program where we're teaching the art of tailoring, and we're teaching people a skill, and then we'll place them in an apprenticeship, and then we'll follow them to make sure they can either get a job where they can keep, or they can start their own business, which is what most people choose to do. So we need to create opportunities much more quickly. And it should start when people are still in prison. We should be asking people while they're inside, what do you want to do when you're coming out? And we should have a list of opportunities, pre-apprenticeship programs throughout the city that they can join on an area they want to be in. And that way, you don't spend, like I did, 16 months being homeless and penniless. It is a horrible experience to live. In fact, coming home was worse than prison. Going into these transitional housing units were more unsafe for me than prison was, and prison wasn't safe. Wow. So we basically need to transform the way most people like myself hate the word reentry, because we didn't come from another planet, and we don't want to re-enter. We just were someplace else.
Right.
So our language is very strange. Returning citizens, I say to them, returning from where?
Right.
I was in New York. I went to prison. I'm back. I didn't go anywhere.
Sounds like I can see you. Sounds like a little bit of an outer space term. I got you. You referenced incarceration, confinement. Talk to us. Take us behind the walls for those who have never been. What does it look like today? What are the conditions of confinement for those who are subject to be there?
Well, I will talk about my 2 main concerns. Number 1. Extreme weather and natural disasters. There is an intersection between climate change and mass incarceration that doesn't often get talked about. Right now, people who are sitting and prisons are not air conditioned. Prisons, as an example, in Texas, prisons are not, now they have about 20% air conditioned. Prisons aren't air conditioned, so people if it's 100 degrees or 110 degrees outside, it's 120 inside. It's not breathable, and people are dying, and it's not being reported. The pigs that they raise at those same Texas prisons are in air conditioning, which I approve of since I love animals. But as the weather gets worse, as we're dealing with the heat, people in Rikers are baking. They are probably dealing with heat exhaustion, heat stroke, and those conditions can lead to you becoming delirious. But another important point, if you're sitting in 100-degree temperature and you're taking psychotropic medications or you're taking antidepressants, the combination of heat and those medications lead to aggressive behavior, among other things. And in prison, if you unintentionally are aggressive, not due to anything you didn't start a fight, you will get put in solitary. So these conditions are horrendous for people across the country. The second issue, which even though the Congress passed the Prison Rape Elimination Act in 2003, on uh, 20 years later, we are dealing with the highest level of sexual violence, particularly in women's prisons. Um, that it hasn't stopped because people are not held accountable for their behavior, and behind the wall, you can basically um, do anything you want without consequence.
That's pretty intense when you think about the fact that, yeah, little
Oh,
consequences.
and I mean, also when if you think of Rikers locally, uh, it is it, when I as far as jails go, it is outrageous to keep people in jail who are have not been convicted of a crime. It's outrageous. Arrest doesn't mean you're guilty, and the issue of letting people come out, particularly during this heat. The other end of the issue is we have people incarcerated in our jails and prisons who have dementia and Alzheimer's. And even though on the books you have the compassionate release, and on the books you have commutations and pardons and clemency, um, you, you only do 1,000 when 14,000 people who are eligible apply. Let people out of prison. And my fear is that with all the passage of laws, particularly in the South, and right now, as we sit here, billion-dollar businesses are being built all over different parts of the country. And I have to ask the question, are they going to incarcerate women who have miscarriages, accusing them of trying to have abortions? And the answer is already yes. So going forward, I think we're going to look at a doubling of mass incarceration if things continue to go as is. We are facing a depending on the outcome of the election, and even not depending on the outcome of the election, individual states are criminalizing behaviors, every kind of behavior, and it impacts women, it impacts minorities. And I fear that we will not have 2.3 million, but 5 million people within the next couple of years in prison, should the outcome of this election be a certain way.
Advocacy. That's got to be the name of the game, right? Advocacy, civic engagement, and awareness. How have you been able to get the message out, sharing with people within community, the difficulties, the things that you're addressing right here? What's it been like for you?
So one out of every four formerly incarcerated people are actually registered to vote, and less than that vote. And many people who you talk to and who are intelligent will say, I'm not voting for the people that put me in prison. And even if you point out to them that there are carceral positions like sheriffs and district attorneys and um, go down the list, judges, um, and also there are ballot initiatives, which, like in Florida, trying to get people the right to vote, even though DeSantis pulled that back. Um, uh, there are ballot initiatives that can be helpful. We are a tough community. However, there are 80 million people who've been convicted of a crime, and not all of them went to prison. But we represent a potential voting bloc that would be very significant, but we are not a voting bloc. Every state, every activist I know is attempting to get people to register to vote and get them out to vote, but it is a big struggle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, given the fact that we have a former president right now that has been convicted on 34 counts, yet still has the ability to vote in the state of Florida, you have a lot of people who are saying, when it comes to voters' rights, that this should be considered for all persons, given the fact that if you're a felon and you have the right to vote in Florida and run for the highest office in the land, the people who are incarcerated should be afforded a second chance and equal opportunity to be able to have a say in the community in which they've also done some injustice.
Yes, but they have to want to have they have to want to have a say. It's very hard to rebuild your life at the same time as getting civically engaged. I'm a small nonprofit that's still 10, I've been out of prison 10 years. The nonprofit's been open a number of years. We are not the people that are getting funding. Mass incarceration is not an issue people want to fund right now. The level of individual donors has drastically been reduced, not just for me, but for all the people I know in New York. And the level of foundation funding for mass incarceration has gone down. Because what happens is people start to fund other issues. And if we don't get funding, we don't have the time to teach people because we're spending too much time struggling to keep our organizations afloat. But we still try. I mean, I have an event this Sunday. It's the 4th annual Suitcase Sunday out in Queens, where we have 30 formerly incarcerated vendors. We do this to give people an opportunity to sell their goods and services, and we do this because my strong feeling about changing the narrative is until you meet us up close and personal, you're not going to change your mind. But when you do meet us, you like us. And that it's a game changer to meet us in person. And we do voter registration, but we still need monies to be directed for specific campaigns to get our population and other underserved populations out there. I mean, with former President Trump saying he's going to deport 15 to 20 million legal and illegal immigrants, you would think people would get engaged to vote because they might have a fear that they may be one of those that are deported. But there's not enough fear in the environment for what's about to happen to our democracy.
Yeah. And for yourself, how do people connect with the work that you're doing and how can they support it?
Well, the name of the organization is Witness to Mass Incarceration. Our website is witnesstomassincarceration.org. We need individual donors. We need foundation donors. We need support. We are actually doing work that helps not 10,000 people, but if we can place 15 people each class into a job, that's 15 people less that are likely to not recidivate. And the other piece is to support all the organizations that are led by formerly incarcerated people who are doing different kinds of work on the ground.
Well, Evie, we got to leave it there, but I want to thank you so much for joining us. Evie Litwok, our guest, and thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for inviting me. I appreciate it.
All righty. Thank you much. And so I want to let you know Evie Litwok, who is the founder and executive director, Witness to Mass Incarceration, and you can support her work by looking her up on social media and then also the website. Taking a quick break. We'll be back with more right after this. And we are back. Our next guest is a distinguished leader, deeply engaged in faith-based community organizing, for justice. He has a rich background in advocating for social and environmental causes. His insights promise to shed light on the urgency of environmental justice in underserved communities and the imperative of equity in shaping our environmental discourse. Here now is the pastor of the Metropolitan African Methodist Episcopal Church, Pastor William H. Lamar IV. And Pastor Lamar, thank you for being with us.
Daren, thank you for having me. It's an honor.
Yeah, glad to have this conversation because I think when we talk about social justice, as I mentioned in a previous segment, that sometimes environmental justice doesn't always get the justice it deserves when it comes to social justice. How are you seeing environmental justice play out right now?
Well, Daren, you can't talk about justice itself without having a conversation that does not bifurcate, that does not separate any of the components that would make for a flourishing and an abundant life for all communities. Therefore, you can't talk about, you were talking earlier about prison industrial complex, you talk about education, we talk about the ravages of what the late James Lawson would call plantation capitalism. You have to frame all of these injustices within what I would call an environmental milieu, or within a discussion of the health of the planet Earth. Because if the planet is not healthy, then we are not healthy. If the planet is not thriving, then we cannot thrive. I remember one of my mentors said that the Earth indeed will replenish itself without us, but we ourselves cannot be replenished without the Earth. And if you think about the heat that we are experiencing, so I live in Washington, D.C., and live outside of Washington, work in the city. And on yesterday, when my wife and I got in the car, it was 115 degrees according to the car's thermometer. This type of sweltering heat affects and afflicts Black people, brown people, poor people, more so than any others. In tree-lined communities, in communities with reflective surfaces like light-colored roofs, light-colored paving, impervious surfaces where water is able to be collected and reused, it can be 20 degrees cooler. And what we've learned in the work that we're doing in environmental justice is that the indication of extreme hot days drives social crises. It drives crime. It drives health disparity. Literally, people are dying and being cooked in these hot places. And these places were designed to be hotter. I was reading through the biography of Robert Moses, who designed New York City largely, and really did it without a sense of justice, did it designing the city to keep Black people and poor people and brown people away from parks, away from swimming pools. When they designed these cities, they were clear that our communities would not get trees, would not get parks, would not get green space. This is written into the geography of our cities. And because public policy created it, not only by disinvesting, but I would argue by stealing tax dollars from Black, brown, and poor communities and using those dollars to make sure that wealthy communities were green, to make sure they were cooler, we have to repatriate those dollars. And it is best to help all of us by lifting up the beauty and cooling the communities where those who struggle most are gathered and where we live.
Unpack that a little bit more for us, because I think sometimes we don't have those conversations. And the Robert Moses conversation is a great one to know about you talk about environmental justice, but you have to talk about environmental discrimination. And that's where it first really begins, that there is this discrimination that pre-exists what we're seeing right now that plays out in so many areas. So when you find out why certain people aren't by parks or aren't by spaces that are profitable, or everyday spaces that we should be partaking in, there's a reason behind it.
Well, Daren, you raise an excellent point. So for those of you not familiar with the work by the great Robert Caro, The Power Broker, about Robert Moses, who created modern day New York City, who accumulated bureaucratic power, so much so that governors of the state of New York, mayors of the city of New York, presidents of the United States could not touch him because of the way that he insulated himself bureaucratically and legislatively. What he did was he built throughways, parkways, highways that demolished Black communities, that demolished white ethnic communities. And he created park spaces, green spaces. And you read the book, he was very clear that these communities would not benefit, that these were not the kinds of people he wanted to go to his parks, to go to public swimming pools. This is by design. I need us to understand when we go through Black, brown, poor communities, and they are hotter, understand that this is not the will of God, that this is not what the divine intends, that human beings created cities where we would be in the places that were hotter, where we would be near places that are chemically compromised by industrial waste. I mean, you can compare what Robert Moses did to keep Black people away from parks and green spaces and to aggregate us in colonies of poverty to what happens in my own native southeastern United States, where we have cancer alleys in multiple states throughout the South, where people have for years discarded of industrial waste near Black and brown communities. My wife is from one of those communities. Her family members have been ravaged by cancer. I have other family members from South Georgia ravaged by cancer. And so these things are not happenstance. And today, all of the drivers for inequity can be tied to the health of the earth and to the heat that people are experiencing. I mean, when we were out yesterday, Daren, the heat was wilting, and everybody was saying, I've never felt what I'm feeling now, and it will get hotter. I just read yesterday that James Inhofe died, a U.S. Senator, I think from Oklahoma. He was a climate denier. We are electing people who deny the reality of science, and not just science. I mean, my grandfather might say he didn't have any degrees in science, but I know what I feel. I know the earth. I know what I'm used to. I know what I can track. My body is not lying to me, and what we see is not lying to us.
So let me push this out a little bit further because, and incidentally, you know, Robert Moses has a parkway up here in New York. If you're going up to Niagara Falls, for those that don't know, if you ride on Niagara Falls, it's called the Robert Moses Parkway. But enough with Robert Moses. He's got enough credibility. I mean, I should say press for the day. But let me talk about this right here. When we talk about environmental action, calls to action, dealing with it. A little earlier, I was talking with the guest, Tucson, Arizona. We referenced Flint, Michigan, talked about what's going on there, how we really have to, you know, address this. It seems as though we're not getting as many people on the field to be to wave the flag to say there's something wrong. We are seeing a lot of people talk about climate change more than ever before. I was in a conversation with our former President Al Gore, and he said there's more people. He said, before I looked like I was the only guy, you know, and there's a few of us who are out there, and we look like the oddballs. He said, but it seems like there's more balls that are now becoming odd, and more people are joining on. How do you feel about his statement? Like, you know, have we gotten more people in the area of environmental justice? And two, I'll come back and talk a little bit about the church because that's where you're housed and that's where I'm familiar with. Talk to us about the church and also how we can be more engaged in this area.
Thanks, Daren. So let me start. I think that the former vice president, who should have been president of the United States if we really had a democracy, we can talk later about the fundamental, I would call, evil of the Electoral College, which takes and destroys the will of the majority in the nation. We talk about that later. But I think that Mr. Gore is correct, especially when we interface with younger people. So part of the work that got me to your wonderful platform to discuss this is we are funded by two philanthropies to help Black churches and Black organizations on the ground who are fighting for cooler climates in their environments. We're funding them to do projects to help communities flourish in New Orleans and San Antonio and other places But the young people with whom we interface, Howard University undergraduates and others that we work with, they see climate as an existential crisis, and they are correct. We were on Capitol Hill 2 days ago. One of the gentlemen with us is the chief of sustainability for the city of San Antonio, Texas. And he said there are places in San Antonio that get to between 125 and 135 degrees Fahrenheit, where people cannot go outside with children nor pets. That will interrupt the entire economy. That will interrupt how we live and order our lives. And we see young people who literally are going into mental health crises because they can see that I'll be 50 next month, that should they live to be 50, 70, 80, they will not be able to live the lives that they know now because it will be too hot for certain activity. And that will further plunge us into climate crises, because that means that we will more frequently amp up air conditioning. It's a feedback loop of death and despair, which can be corrected. So one of the things we're doing with the church, we're talking about smart surfaces. So Daren, you can cool communities 10, 12, 15 degrees by planting trees. We were talking at that same congressional hearing that you can be under a tree on a hot day and it's 18 to 20 degrees cooler. You try it yourself. We're talking about no more paving with dark, hot asphalt, which traps heat and then radiates heat all night long. Green roofs, planting trees on roofs, collecting water. Many of our neighborhoods are surrounded, pockmarked by parking lots and schools. Turn those parking lots into green spaces. Have it where cars can park on gravel. There are things that can be done, but what we're facing now, Daren, is this. The concrete lobby, very powerful. Other lobbies that work with cities and states and sell infrastructure to them do not want to see us to move in this direction because it hurts the bottom line. So always in America, the question is one of capitalism. The question is one of money. Will we be more concerned with profits or people? The problem is, if all of the people are too hot, all the people have died because the planet is dying, there will be no profits to be made. When will there be enough? There is a way for us to live together and care for one another. And one of the things that the mathematical and economic models say is over-investing in communities that have been robbed of this green infrastructure will help all of us become more healthy.
Pastor Lamar, I got to ask you a question, because when we talk about community, I mean, that's it right there. We know that we have to have a voice. And when it comes to Black and brown communities, sometimes the question is, or the allegation is, we don't focus on this issue of environmental justice, which brings to light, engagement. We can become politically engaged, and we're politically engaged on a lot of different things, but when it comes to environmental justice, we're bringing up the rear.
You know, what I would argue, Daren, is some can see it that way, but what I think it is, it's more to me a question and challenge of exposure and perspective. I can take you to groups in cities like Jacksonville, Florida, New Orleans, Louisiana, coastal cities, where there are scores of Black people on the front line doing this work, but they don't get media exposure. They're not talking to cable news. They're not talking to BronxNet. They're not being lifted up. The media often lifts up stories that continue the narratives that will help them maintain the world as it is. So one of the things I argue, and there's much scholarship out there, that Black criminality is a narrative that helps build wealth for non-Black people. So here's an example. If you keep saying that in this neighborhood, Black people are killing each other, Black people are killing each other, if you keep, as a newspaper and local news, telling that story, then what you do is you drive down property values. What happens then is speculators and vultures come in, buy up neighborhoods where Black people once lived, and now when you go back to the neighborhood you grew up in, you can't afford a blade of grass because it's been completely gentrified. And a part of that story was a narrative of black criminality that is no more true than any narrative of white criminality. What people will tell you is there is no such thing as black on black crime. That's a marketing myth. You don't hear about white on white crime when white people kill white people at a rate similar and sometimes more than black people kill black people, or the myth about black people being addicted to drugs. No more black people use drugs than white people. But these are myths that feed into systems of oligarchy, that feed into systems of kleptocracy. Black people have always been doing this work, but people are not telling the story. If people want to tell the story, I can connect you with the folks who will shatter these myths, and you will be able to find out exactly who's on the front lines making it happen.
Amazing. I know we do need to put that out there because I think so many times we have been misled, hoodwinked, bamboozled, run amok, led astray, right? You know, we've gotten that to the place that we don't think that there is activism that's out there. But talk to us about the church and how can the church can be more active and where the church is active in this area.
Let me say this. The Black church has also been a victim of these stories. The Black church has been a fugitive organization from our birth. We have harbored those enslaved people who determined they would be a part of revolution, and they would cut swaths through the people and land who were enslaving them. We've been a revolutionary organization from our inception. It is just recently when Black churches became more and more underneath the dizzying, death-dealing sway of white evangelicalism that we stopped being who we were. Harriet Tubman came from among us. Nat Turner came from among us. Malcolm X came from among us because his father, Earl Little, was a Black Baptist preacher and a Garveyite. All of these people were nourished by us. And Metropolitan AME Church, where I serve, I got connected with this group doing environmental work because we were part of a lawsuit suing Coca-Cola and the sugary sweetened beverage industry, which sells sugar beverages to us as if they're health beverages, which they are not. And so we then connected with them, and they were looking for Black churches who would amplify the fact that our people are dying as a result of heat. They're dying because they can't go outside, they can't exercise. And all of the social indicators of turmoil are enhanced in places that are hotter. So the church has always been on the front line of liberation, and this is just one of the many fronts of the fight.
Pastor Lamar, I got to leave it there, but I got to bring you back, though. If that's all right with you, we got to make sure we get a chance to bring you back and share a little bit more in this conversation because it's much needed. And I think that people need to know what's happening with some people who's got some boots on the ground, but not just boots on the ground, but some real credible information. Thank you, my brother, for being with us.
Daren, thank you, brother. Y'all take care.
Hey, listen, all right. Pastor William Lamar. Listen, I got to let you know we're at the end of our show today. Hope you enjoyed this week's discussion on the Bronx Social Justice Forum. Now, listen, if you're rewatching this episode, catch Recablecast right here, BronxNet.org. If you want to join the conversation, present your point of view, join us on our social media at BronxNet TV. And then we encourage you, come back again. We'll be back next week, if the Lord allows, as we say, continuing to elevate the discussion and bringing further awareness across the globe. I'm Daren Jaime, saying take care, God bless. We'll catch you on the next Social Justice Forum.